Hello and welcome back to another video. So today I've got another full PC build guide for you, and I'm going to be putting all the parts in front of me together and coming up with a fully working PC by the end of the video. So if you've never built a PC before, you've come to the right place. I'm going to be going through everything step by step and making the process really straightforward. So starting off with the case, this is a mini-itx case. It's the Killer Master NR200P. And although it's a small case, it offers an awful lot of options when it comes to building a PC. And you can build a number of completely different looking PCs in the same case. The first thing to mention is the front panel is interchangeable, and the case comes with a tempered glass panel in the box. So we can swap out this front panel for a tempered glass panel if we wanted to. The other thing to mention is the case has a vertical GPU mount and riser card included with it. So again, if we wanted to, we can install our graphics card in a vertical or horizontal orientation in the same case without having to purchase any additional hardware. So although this is a small case, you can actually fit an awful lot of cooling into it. So on the side, you can actually fit a 280mm radiator, while down the bottom it will take a 240mm radiator. Although the theme of today's build is air cooling, so I've picked up a premium air cooler from BQAT. It's the Dark Rock TF. So this should hopefully do a great job of cooling our CPU, which the CPU I've chosen is the Ryzen 7 3700X. This is an 8-core CPU which should handle gaming fairly comfortably, but also with its 8 cores will be very comfortable for content creation as well. For the motherboard, I've gone with MSI's B550i Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. This motherboard has two M.2 SSD slots, and like most B550 motherboards, only one of them is Gen 4, while the other one will support Gen 3 speeds. With that in mind, I've picked up two M.2 SSDs, both in 1TB in size. I've picked up one Gen 4 drive, the 980 Pro from Samsung, and another one from Samsung in Gen 3 speeds, the 970 Evo. I've also picked up a 500GB SATA SSD. It's from Kingston, the KC600. I think I've probably got enough storage with the 2TB on the M.2 SSDs, but I want to show you how to install a SATA drive in this case as well. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Trident Z Neo at 3600MHz speed. Powering the whole build, I've got a 750W SFX power supply from Corsair. It's the SF750. For the graphics card, I've gone with the RTX 2070 Super. For cooling, the case comes with two 120mm fans included, and they're designed to be used at the top of the case, but you can actually fit a further 5 fans in the case. On the side, it's two 120 or 140mm fans. Down the bottom, you can fit a further two 120mm fans, and on the rear of the case, you can fit a 92mm fan. So I am planning to maximise the air cooling in this case and try and fill all possible fan slots. So I've picked up a range of fans, mostly from the Noctua Chromax range, and these are 120mm fans in a range of sizes. So there's their standard thickness, but I've also picked up some low profile fans to use down the bottom of the case below the GPU. I've also picked up a 92mm fan from BQAT. It's one of their Pure Wings 2 fans to use on the rear of the case. Okay, so that's all the parts for today's build. Let's get on with the build. The first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels, dust filters, anything that's going to get in our way during the build. To remove the side panel, all we need to do is pull it out from the back, and then it should simply lift up and out. The other side panel is exactly the same. Again, just pull it out from the back and lift it up and out. To remove the front panel, all we need to do is pull it away, and it should clip out. To remove the top panel, all we need to do is lift up at the front of the case, and it should simply pop off. There's a removable fan and radiator bracket on the side, held on with 2 screws here. Once the screws are removed, it can simply be lifted off. Down at the bottom of the case, we've got an accessory box. We'll have a look at what it contains later in this section. This bracket is our power supply holder. It's held on with 2 screws at the back of the case. Before we can remove the bracket from the case, we just need to free up the case cables and the Velcro straps. We should now simply be able just to lift it off This front section of the case is held on with 4 screws here, here, here and here. And then we should simply be able to lift it off. To remove the bottom of the case, we just need to loosen this screw. And then we should simply be able just to lift the case away from the bottom. Looking at the bottom of the case, if we turn it upside down, you'll notice at the bottom there's a dust filter which can be simply pulled away, held on by magnets. Likewise, in each of the side panels we've also got dust filters, again held on by magnets, which can simply be removed. So that's the case prepared. We've got all the panels off. Obviously you don't need to remove as many panels as I have, but if you do, it's going to make building in the case so much easier. The problem with any small form factor case is building in it is so much more tricky than in a bigger case. We've made just much more room for us to get in from the top and at the front, so hopefully the build process is going to be a little bit easier because of it, and any time that we've spent taking the panels off and on will hopefully save us time later in the build. Next thing I want to do is have a look at what comes with the accessories. This case comes with 2 accessory boxes. In the first one we've got our tempered glass panel. So we can replace the front side panel with this. This is the second accessory box, so we'll open it up and see what's in it. So this is what's contained in that accessory box. So we've got 2 120mm fans together with the mounting solution to attach the fans to the top of the case. So these are brackets which simply pull out, and then we're going to be able to push them through and secure to the top of the case, and they are compatible with other 120mm fans. Looking at the fans, they've got 4-pin connections on them. We've also got a PWM splitter cable, so it's a 1 connection to 3 connection, which is very useful for building in an ITX case because generally the motherboards have very limited fan headers. We've got a riser cable for our graphics card, which we're going to need to use the vertical slots. And then what I'll do is I'll open this bag up separately and talk you through each of the screws. This is what's contained in the screw section of the accessory box. So part A is a little adapter which helps you loosen and tighten up the standoffs at the back of the case where the motherboard will be screwed into. So this simply fits over the standoffs, and you can then use a normal screwdriver to loosen them and tighten them up again. Part B is some cable ties to help with cable management in the case. We've got 12 screws C, and you can tell screws C apart from screws J. They look very similar to each other. Screw J has a more rounded head and there's only 4 of them. Screw C is designed to secure the motherboard to the case and also to secure the power supply to the bracket. And like I say, we've got 12 of these. Parts D and E look fairly similar. If we have a look at part D, there's only 4 of them, and it has a little cross at the top of the thread. Part E, there's much more of them, there's 12 of them, and it has a straight thread at the top of it. So part D, you're going to screw into the back of a 3.5-inch drive, and this lets you mount one 3.5-inch drive in the case. Part E will screw into a 2.5-inch hard drive or SSD, and as we've got 12, each drive is going to take 4. It's going to let you mount 3 drives in the case. Part F is where you're actually going to mount the drives to. So these are going to slip into little sections in the case, and then what you can do is after you've screwed this into the drive is simply going to push into here, and it's going to hold the drive in place. So we've got 12 of these, again letting you mount 3 drives in the case. And the final set of screws J, you're going to use these to help secure the top of the case to the rest of the case. And again, this is an option if you want to do this. This is our motherboard, and we're going to do as much work with the motherboard as we can on the table before we install it into the case. So we're going to go ahead and put our CPU into the socket in the middle of the motherboard. We're going to install our M.2 SSDs, one here on the front and a further drive on the back of the motherboard. And we're also going to insert our RAM into here before putting the motherboard into the case. So the first step is to prepare the socket to receive the CPU. To do this, all we need to do is lift this little clip here all the way over to the right hand side. Okay, so this is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding the CPU by the sides, and the reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins on the bottom of it. If I do that, I can make the CPU absolutely useless. The other thing I want to point out about the CPU, if you notice that the corner at the top of the screen has a little gold triangle on it, and none of the other corners on the CPU have that triangle. If I turn the CPU over, you'll notice the same corner that had the gold triangle, which is now the one down the bottom left hand side, also has a little gold mark on this side, and that is to line the CPU up with the socket in the right orientation. So we take a closer look at our socket. What you'll notice, this corner over the top left hand side has a little white mark on it, and this is the corner that we need to line up with the gold triangle on the CPU. So to install our CPU, all we need to do is hover it over the socket, and we're going to let it fall into the socket. So I'm just going to move it about a little bit till it falls in. And you hear there, the CPU has just fallen into the socket. It's really important I don't go pressing down where I can damage the pins. All I need to do to finish installing the CPU is to close this little clip. And we've now installed our CPU. Next thing to do is install the front M.2 SSD. To do that, we just need to remove 2 screws from the heatsink over the top of the socket. So we now can move the heatsink to expose the M.2 SSD socket. We need to be careful because the heatsink is still held on with a wire, so all we're going to do is move it over to the side and out of the way of the socket. This is our M.2 SSD. What you'll notice over the right hand side, there's gold connectors where it's going to plug into the motherboard. There's a further little gold connector over the left hand side, and that is where we're going to secure it in place using a screw that we're going to get in our motherboard box. As we've mentioned, this motherboard has 2 M.2 SSD sockets. We've got one on the front and one on the back. It's important to check the specifications of each of the socket on your motherboard because in general they're not created equally. If we look at our socket on the front, we'll notice that there's a heatsink over it with a fan, which is going to help keep our drive cool under load. I'll show you the one on the back in a minute, but there's no heatsink on the one on the back. So already the one on the front seems to be a better socket, particularly for a Gen 4 drive, which is going to get much hotter than a Gen 3 drive under load. The other thing to look and see which of the sockets supports which speed. Our motherboard manual tells us that the front socket supports Gen 4 speeds, while the back socket only supports Gen 3 speeds. So it's important we install our Gen 4 drive into the socket on the front of the motherboard and the Gen 3 drive into the one on the back of the motherboard. So all motherboards are different, so it's really important you check the specifications of your own motherboard if you're using a different one than what I'm using here. The other important thing to mention, particularly with mini-itx builds, they are much more complicated to add to at a later stage. So if you think you're going to need more storage, I would recommend you put it in at this stage in the build, because it's going to be an awful pain to take the motherboard out at a later stage to get access to that socket at the back of the motherboard. Okay, so having a look here, this is our M.2 SSD socket here, over to the right hand side, and over to the left hand side we've got 2 standoffs here, which we can secure it in place. And if we just line our M.2 SSD up, we can see it's this standoff in the furthest position that we're going to secure it into. Other motherboards will come with just one standoff, and what you can do is unscrew it and move it along to a different socket if you've got a different sized drive. To install our M.2 SSD, all we need to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket. Next, we need to secure it in place using the screw that comes with the motherboard. Next, we can put the heatsink back on and secure it in place. Before we put the heatsink back on, it's important to mention if you are using the motherboard for the first time, quite often on these heatsinks you will have some plastic protection which you should remove before first use. So we can simply return the heatsink to its normal location, put our screws back in, and then secure the heatsink to the motherboard again. This is our second M.2 SSD socket on the back of the motherboard. Again, you can see one standoff here and a slot for another standoff. So the standoff looks to be in the right place, so we can go ahead and install our drive into the socket, just inserting it at a slight angle, and then all we need to do is secure it in place using the screw from the motherboard box. Okay, so this is our RAM. One important thing to notice with it is the gold connectors at the bottom. You'll notice that the one over to the right hand side is slightly longer than the one on the left hand side. So it's really important when lining it up in the socket that you insert it the right way round. To prepare the motherboard to receive the RAM, all we need to do is open these two little clips on the sockets. Now it's important to note some motherboards will have clips on both sides of the socket. This motherboard just has clips on this side. The next thing to do is to line the RAM up with the socket. Once we're happy everything is lined up, all we need to do is apply some firm pressure to the top of the RAM and it will lock into place and this little clip will close. Just the same process with the second stick of RAM, line it up with the socket and then we're going to just apply some firm pressure to the top of the RAM and then it locks and clicks into place. Before we go ahead and put our motherboard into the case, we just need to change the brackets for the CPU cooler. Our CPU cooler is going to use a different bracket which comes with it, so we just need to remove this standard bracket. Each of the brackets is held on with two screws which we can go ahead and remove. Next we can remove the backplate from the back of the motherboard by simply sliding it out. This is the new backplate for our CPU cooler. What you'll notice that each corner has two little holes in it. One of them is marked AM4, so all we need to do is insert one of these standoffs through each of the holes that says AM4. What we can now do is set our motherboard over the top of the backplate. Next we need to put a little plastic washer over each of these standoffs. And then there's four little clips to go over the top. Next thing is to prepare the brackets which we're going to put onto the cooler. So again you'll notice there's two holes here. One of them is marked AM4, that's the one that we're going to need to use. So what we need to do is take this little screw, pass it through, turn it upside down, and then screw on over the top. And it does come with a little spanner to help you tighten it up. Okay, so that's one bracket done, just the same process with the next one. Okay, so again, making sure we're going through the holes marked AM4. Drop these through. Turn things upside down. Next thing to do is to secure each of the brackets to the cooler. They're held on each with two screws. Okay, same again the other side. Next thing for us to do is to get our fans onto the heatsink. This cooler comes with two fans of the same size. This is the front of the fan. We can tell it's the front because we can see the logo and the fan blades are unobstructed. The back of the fans tend to have the text on it, and we've also got these four bits of plastic obstructing the fan blades. Air will come in through the front of a fan and out the back. So we want to install our fans with the logo facing up. So it's blowing air from outside the case in and through the cooler. If we installed it the wrong way round, it would be trying to get air from the motherboard, which wouldn't be very effective. So it's important we install both the fans in this orientation, bringing cool air from outside the case in and through the heatsink. The other thing we need to factor in is where the cable is coming from the fan. They're going to plug into the CPU fan header, which is going to be over here. So I'm going to bring the cable out here and put the fan on this way round. So if I go ahead and put the little metal clips on, center the fan up on top of the heatsink, and then if I just pull these little clips down on each side, it should lock into place. There we go, that's one side on, and that's the other one on. Now the fan below, it's going to be the same story, but this time the clips are going to pull the fan up and into the heatsink above. So I'm going to go ahead and slide the fan in between the two heatsinks. Then I'm going to go ahead and pull the little metal clips through the holes in the fan, and this time we're going to pull the fan up this way. Just pushing on these little metal bits here. We'll turn the fan round and do the same thing with the other side. So in through the holes in the fan, apply a little bit of pressure to each of these metal clips, and that just gets them locked in to place. Just before we go ahead and install our cooler onto the motherboard, we need to remove this little layer of plastic protection. Next, we need to add a little bit of thermal paste to the center of the CPU. It's normally about a pea-sized amount just in the middle of the CPU. Okay, that looks about right. Then we just need to lower our cooler down, lining up the bracket with the backplate. Once things are in place, we just need to turn things upside down. So I'm just going to tighten each of these in turn just a little bit at a time so we don't put too much tension on any one side of the cooler at once. Okay, so that's nicely tightened in. Next thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug our fans in. Included with the CPU cooler, we get a twin fan splitter cable. So we need to go and plug the cables coming from our fans into this splitter cable. That's one in. And there's the second one in and connected. Now what we need to do is plug the other end of this cable into our CPU fan header socket on the motherboard. Okay, our CPU headers are these two here just beside the RAM. The one closest to the RAM is for the CPU fan header. The one furthest away towards the edge of the motherboard is the pump header. So we want to plug into this closest one to the RAM, the CPU fan header. So I'm just going to line this up with the socket. The cable can only go in one way round. And then just apply a little bit of pressure and it pushes into place. Next I'm just going to bring these cables around and out of the way at the back. Just looking at these fan cables, and they look a little bit untidy here. I think if the fan was rotated round 180 degrees, the cable would hopefully be out of the way. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. So I'll try this with the top fan first of all, if I free it up. Okay, so that now looks a lot tidier with the cables all tucked in at the top. We're now ready to get the motherboard into the case. Okay, so we can go ahead and slide our motherboard into the case. Important to mention, our motherboard has a pre-applied I/O shield. If yours doesn't, go ahead and insert your I/O shield first of all. And what you can see at the back of the case, we've got the standoffs where we're going to screw our motherboard into. We just need to insert the motherboard so it lines up with the hole at the back of the case. And then it will rest on the little standoff, so once it's in the right place. Then all we need is 4 screws from the motherboard accessory box. Okay, that's our motherboard installed. The first thing I like to do after installing the motherboard in the case is to plug in the case cables. And the reason for that, once we start adding more and more into the build, it gets much more difficult to access the motherboard. In general, I don't normally install a CPU cooler. This was quite a tricky CPU cooler to install, so obviously it was much easier to install out on the table. And I'm going to have a little bit more difficulty plugging some of the cables in, but because this is quite a nice case with the top off, and I've got pretty good access from the bottom, I think actually weighing things up, installing the cooler on the motherboard and the table is going to be much easier, and hopefully we'll get the cables plugged in without too much difficulty. I think trying to install the cooler with the motherboard in the case would have been much more difficult. So the case cables, what are the case cables? And it's these 3 cables coming from the front I/O. So we've got a USB cable here, which is going to go in this header on the motherboard, and that's going to let our 2 USB Type A ports on the top of the case work. We've got a HD audio cable, which is going to let our headphone and microphone jack at the front of the case work, and it normally plugs into the header down at the bottom left hand side on the motherboard. And then we've got these front panel connectors, which tend to be for your power switch, reset switch, and power LED. And a lot of times these come as little tiny separate cables, and they're much more difficult to plug in. One of the nice things about this case is all the cables have been combined into a single connector, so we're just going to have to plug them in one go, which is a really nice feature, particularly for a mini-itx case where space is difficult and plugging in cables is that wee bit more difficult. Okay, so let's make a start with our USB 3.0 cable. It's important we lined up the right way. There's a little notch here, and the socket has a little notch on this side, so we need to line them up the right way around. Out of all the cables that you're going to plug in, this is the one where you're most likely to damage the pins on your motherboard. So be really careful. If it doesn't go easy, don't push it, or you'll end up damaging the pins and then your front I/O isn't going to work. Okay, so let's just line this up with the socket. And you see the cooler is getting a little bit in the way, but it's not too bad. And then I'm just going to push it in gently. And there's it clicked and locked into place. Okay, next cable to plug in is our HD audio cable. It's going to go in this header in the bottom row just over to the left hand side. If we note the pin on the top row, the second pin from the right hand side is missing. There's also a pin missing on the cable, so we'll need to line it up the right way, and that is with the HD audio text facing upwards. Okay, that's lined up, and we just go ahead and push it on. You can see the cooler is getting a little bit in the way, but it's not too bad. Okay, so the header next to that is where we need to plug in our power LED, power switch and reset switch. And as we've mentioned, it's with the text with the power switch and power LED facing upwards. So I'm now going to go ahead and plug a couple of extra cables into the motherboard at this stage, and the reason for doing it now is the longer I leave it and add more things into the build, the harder it is going to be to access the motherboard. So we mentioned we're going to install one SATA drive, so I'm going to plug one SATA data cable. We have the 4 SATA ports here, so I'm just going to pick any one of these and plug a SATA data cable into it. There's a little L-shaped connector on it, so it's just important we line it up with the socket and then push it into place. The other cable I'm going to go ahead and plug in at this stage is our triple fan splitter cable into our system fan header, which is down here just to the right of the M.2 SSD heatsink. So I'm going to go ahead and plug it in now as well. So that's all the cables that we're going to need to plug into the motherboard. Okay, so we're now ready to install our power supply into its bracket. So this is the bracket, this is the bottom of the bracket, this is the top. We can see at the top of the bracket there's some holes for screws. Looking at our power supply, this is where the holes are, so it's going to go this way round. Important thing to look at the power supply, we can see there's an intake fan on this side. If we install it this way round, the intake fan is going to be facing the inside of the case. So the fan is going to be getting hot air from inside the case. If we install it this way round, the fan is going to be facing out against the mesh panel at the back, and it's going to be getting cool air from outside the case. So we want to install it this way round. So all we need to do is insert the bracket over the top of the power supply, and then we can go ahead and screw in and secure it in place. And again, we're just going to use the same screws that we used to secure the motherboard from that accessory box. Okay, next thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug in the cables that we're going to need. So we're going to need a 24-pin cable for our motherboard, which, having a look here, it's these two at the top, so we'll go ahead and plug it in. Looking at the slots down below this, they are for PCIe and 4+4 pin CPU. So we're going to need one cable for our CPU. It's labelled CPU on one side and Type 4 on the other. So it's the Type 4 end that's going to go into the power supply. Next thing, our graphics card is going to need a cable. So it is going to need one 8-pin and one 6-pin connector. So what you'll notice is the graphics card pins quite often split into 6 and 2. like here, whereas the CPU pins will sometimes split into a 4 and a 4. This is a full 8-pin CPU cable, but there is other ones that will split into a 4 and a 4. It's another way to tell the cables apart. So we'll go and plug the graphics card cable into the next one along. And as we're going to install a SATA drive, we're going to plug a SATA power cable in as well. And we're just going to plug it along into the next one here beside the 24-pin cable. Okay, that's all the cables installed to the power supply. We can go ahead and get the power supply back into the case. Just before we put our power supply into the case, two things to point out. So you can see at the back of this motherboard there actually is quite a large cutout, and you've actually got full access to this rare M.2 SSD slot. So that's great. What I said at the start, there's not the need to actually go and install this M.2 SSD at the start, because you can access it quite easily at any stage by removing the rear panel. My last mini-itx build, the TU150, I needed to do exactly that. I installed one drive and later decided I was going to have to install another. And actually this slot was blocked at the back of the case, so I had to completely disassemble everything just to install a drive. So you're going to be okay in this case. Next thing to look at is when we're inserting our power supply back in, we've got a little code here into which of these clips we should use. So we've got an SFX power supply, so we're going to install it into this clip here. If you've got an SFXL, you're going to use the slot above. Okay, so we'll go ahead and insert our power supply into the case, into this slot here. And then all we need to do is secure it in place at the back with the 2 screws we removed earlier. Okay, so we can see our power supply's intake fan is facing the outside of the case, where it's going to get plenty of fresh air. Next thing for us to do is to plug the power cable extension coming from the rear of the case into the back of the power supply. And then the other thing to make sure is we've got our power supply switched on, because we're not going to have access to the power supply whenever we finish the build without taking the front panel off. So it is on at the moment. So we're now ready to start plugging some of the cables in from the power supply. So our 8-pin CPU cable is going to go here in the top left hand side of the case. Now already I've realised I normally, when I'm doing a mini-itx build, would have all the power supply cables plugged into the motherboard before I install the motherboard in the case. I thought because I was going to have so much access to this case it would still be quite easy, but what we can see is this power extension cable is actually blocking this cable, so it is going to be a little bit tricky to get this plugged in. There we go, so it's locked and clicked into place. Likewise, our 24-pin cable, which is just here, it would have been much easier to have this cable plugged in before installing the power supply in the case. We still should hopefully be able to manage it. That's things lined up. Just needs a little bit of pressure applied to it from 2 sides. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to briefly loosen up the power supply, plug the cable in, and then put the power supply back again. It's one of the cables I don't want to think I've plugged it in and actually not have it in, and then have an issue with the PC booting. So we'll set the power supply over to the side briefly. So that looks like that's locked and clipped into place. So now we'll get the power supply back where it should be, and we'll tighten things up at the back again. Next we can go ahead and install our SATA SSD. So we turn it over and look at the mounting holes at the back. We've got the little screws from our case accessory box. Remember, this is a 2.5-inch drive, so we're going to use the screws with the straight thread on the top of them. So all we need to do is screw these into each of the holes. Okay, we can go ahead and put this into the case. Okay, so we've got a few places we can mount our SSD in this case. We can mount it here, here, or if we turn the case round, we can mount it here. So So I think I'm going to mount it on the front of the case. So all I need to do is put 4 of these little bits of rubber into the places I'm going to install the drive into. So before I go ahead and put the drive on, I'm just going to plug the cables in. So if you look closely at our SATA SSD, you'll see there's 2 gold connectors. They're both in an L shape. This one to the right hand side, the shorter one, is for the SATA data cable coming from the motherboard. The larger L-shaped cable to the left hand side is for the SATA power cable coming from our power supply. So it's just important we line the L's of each of them up. So there is the data cable getting plugged in. And then just going to bring the SATA power cable in through the bottom and push it into place. Now that's the cables installed, to install the drive on the case, all I need to do is line things up with the holes, and it should just be a matter of pushing it in. And there we go. Certainly one of the easiest SSD mounting that I've done in any case. Okay, next thing for us to do is decide how many case fans we're going to fit in the case. And although this case can support 7 case fans, because we have picked such a big CPU cooler, I can tell you already there's no way we're going to get all 7 case fans installed. So where are the case fan options? One, we can fit a 92mm fan at the rear of the case, and this is our BQAT 92mm fan, and obviously there's no way that is going to fit past the large heatsink on the CPU cooler, so that one's out. We can fit 2 fans at the top of the case, and again I can see a problem here. This is a standard thickness fan, and obviously you can see it sits well above the top of the case. I've got one of my Noctua slim fans. It just about fits into the case. The problem is whenever we add the mounting mechanism in, it's going to be well above the top of the case, and you can't screw the fans in normally to the top of this case. So we're not going to be able to put a fan here above the CPU cooler. Over to the side of the CPU cooler, we shouldn't have any problem fitting a standard thickness 120mm fan. In general, when it comes to a case, you want to be intaking air from the bottom and the front, and then outputting air up the top and the rear. So we're going to have our fan at the top as an exhaust, which means the front of the fan facing into the case. The front panel on the case is solid, so we're not going to have any intake of air at the front. So our intake of air is going to come at the side and at the bottom. So onto the bracket that we installed at the front of the case, we've got the option of installing 2 140mm or 2 120mm fans. So I can already see the CPU cooler is pretty close to the bracket. So we put a fan in beneath it. Let's see. The bracket isn't going to close. If I was to insert one of my slim fans, which is about 1 centimeter smaller, let's see, we'll line that up. Yes, that will fit. Now, I don't know if that's going to be of any benefit. There seems to be 4 or 5 millimeters between the fan and the front of the CPU cooler fan. So that may or may not be a benefit. That's something we're going to test in the thermal testing video. We shouldn't have any problem with a 140 or 120mm fan over to the right hand side of the CPU cooler, and of course we're going to set that as an intake. Down at the bottom of the case, looking where the graphics card is going to go. I think if I install a standard thickness fan, it's going to be pretty close to the graphics card. So what I think I will do is install one of these slim Noctua fans, one here and one here down the bottom, so having 2 of them as intake. Okay, so summing everything up then, we're going to have 2 slim fans at the bottom as an intake. We're going to have a standard fan here set to intake, and a standard fan set here set to exhaust. In my thermal testing, I will add an additional slim fan in front of the CPU cooler to see does that help or hurt with temperatures. Likewise, I'm going to try the standard fans below the GPU in my thermal testing video to see do they actually help or hurt as well. Some of my previous testing has suggested that fans close to the GPU can actually hurt with temperatures rather than help, and others have informed me that slim fans actually can help quite a bit. So that's the reason I'm going for this configuration. So let's get our fans installed. Okay, so this is the bottom of our case. So we can go ahead and remove the dust filter from the bottom of it. Okay, so we've got our two Noctua slim fans. And in the box, you get a selection of anti-vibration pads in a variety of colours. So I'm just going to select the black ones and add these on to the fans. Okay, so looking at our bracket, we want our fans to be intakes, so we need to install them with the front facing down the way. The other thing is we're going to have lots of intake over to the right hand side of the case and very little over to the left. So I'm going to try and get the fans all the way to the left hand side if I can. The other important point is we want the wires coming out the back of the case from the fans so they can't be seen. So we go ahead and turn things over and get the fans screwed in. So really important that we don't over tighten these fans. We only want them very slightly tight. If we over tighten them, you can actually twist the fan out of shape and cause some noise. Okay, so we can go ahead and put our bottom dust filter back on again and turn the things over. Okay, so probably the easiest way of doing this is with the case upside down. And then we can go ahead and secure the bottom of the case back on with the screw we removed earlier. Okay, so now we're ready to install our fan on the top of the case. So I'm going to go with all Noctua fans in this build, so I'm going to use my NF-S12A fan. I've used these fans for a lot of thermal testing in the past and they perform really well. They're quiet and very efficient. I am of course going to test the case fans when I come on to my thermal testing, so I'll let you know how well they perform. So these fans come with rubber anti-vibration pads, 4 of each colour. So I'm going to install some white ones onto the back because I don't have any more black ones. And the black ones will be facing into the case as the front of the fan is going to be facing into the case as an exhaust. Okay, so that's my fan ready to go. Now just looking at, this is the top of the case, so this side is going to be the rear. So I'm going to make sure I have my fan facing that way. So that's it round the right way. Okay, so all we need to do is push this little metal bracket down through the holes in the fans. Just bring it out the rear end as well. There we go. And then all we're going to need to do is line it up with these little rubber pads at the top of the case, and then we just need to push it into place, and that's the fan secured. Really simple and straightforward. So importantly, we've got our fan in an exhaust configuration with the cables facing out towards the back. Okay, before we put our top panel on, we're actually going to have 4 case fans in this case. The motherboard only has one system fan header, and we have plugged a triple fan splitter cable into it, which means we can only plug 3 case fans into this splitter cable, but we're going to have 4 fans. There is one free fan header left, which is the pump header. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this fan into it, and I'll just need to configure that header in the BIOS to run it with the same fan profile as the rest of our case fans. So I'll go ahead and plug it in first because it's going to be easier to plug in before we put the top on. Okay, so that's that plugged in. We just tuck the excess cable into the case, line things up at the front, and that's the top panel back on. Now they did mention that you can use additional screws to secure this top panel, I'm not so worried about that, so I'm happy. I prefer to have easy access to it. So I'm building quite out a sequence with this case, but I think the next thing I probably need to do is a bit of cable management. Tidy up the cables that we have got plugged in, then put the graphics card in, and then finally add the final fan onto the bracket. That's one of the last things that we do. So we'll tidy up some of these cables. Okay, so we've got the cables coming from our bottom fan, so I'm just going to run those down the back of the case. And then I'm going to go ahead and plug them in to two of the sockets out of our triple fan splitter cable. And we'll leave the remaining fan slot free for our front mounted fan. So the rest of these cables, we can have no problem tidying them up. So we've got these little Velcro straps coming from the back. Okay, so I'm just going to bring the little Velcro strap up from the bottom, slide it in through this bit on the front of the power supply bracket, and then fix it down. Okay, so that looks reasonably tidy down the bottom of the case now. I think we could go ahead and get our graphics card installed. Okay, so we've got a twin slot graphics card, so we need to remove two of these little covers, the top one and the second one down. Next, we need to prepare the motherboard to receive the graphics card by opening this little clip here on the PCIe slot. And then we line the graphics card up with the socket. That's us now, I think. So I just give it a little bit of a push and it goes in and locks into place. The clip has closed. And then all we need to do to secure the graphics card is insert the same two screws which we just removed a minute ago. Okay, so we can go ahead and plug in the power supply for the graphics card. So it takes an 8-pin and a 6-pin cable. So we'll go ahead and line the cables up and push them in. There we go. And we can just go ahead and tuck the excess cable over down the bottom of the case here. And we've got our final pin to plug in just sitting here, which is perfect. I think the fan there all the way over to the right hand side looks fine. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get that screwed on. Okay, so just before we put the bracket in place, we'll go ahead and plug our cable in. Okay, that's the cable plugged in, and we can just tuck the excess cable down to the bottom. Okay, so we can go ahead and re-secure this bracket using the two screws that we removed at the start. Okay, so we can go ahead and replace the case panels. Okay, we now come to the moment of truth where we need to flip the power switch and see will the PC boot. Importantly, I've loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, I've made a video on it and I'll put the link to that video in the description. Okay, let's flip the power switch and see what happens. Okay, we've got fans spinning, that's a good sign. And we've got some light starting to appear. So next thing we're looking for is the MSI logo to appear on the monitor. So we'll just have to wait patiently and see does that happen. There we go, we've actually gone straight into the Windows boot up screen. So it's found our Windows 10 bootable USB drive in the back of the PC. Obviously this PC doesn't have any operating system in it, so it's not going to be able to load off the SSDs that we've installed. So it finds the bootable drive in the back and then boots off it. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to install Windows, but to make that easier, I'm going to flip over to the screen mode. Okay, so we're in the United Kingdom, so I'm just going to leave all these and click Next. And then I'm going to click on Install Now. If you've got a Windows 10 product key, you can go ahead and put it in this box. I'll show you what happens if you don't have a product key. So I'm going to click I don't have a product key. What you need to do is select which version of Windows you're going to get a product key for in the future. So I'm going to click on Windows 10 Pro and click Next. Another question I'm often asked is, will Windows work without a product key? And the answer is yes, you can go ahead and install it. There will be a watermark on it and you'll have some limited functionality, but yes, Windows will work without the product key. So I'm going to accept the license terms, click Next, and we're going to do a custom install. Okay, so looking at our drives, we have got 3 drives on this PC. We've got our KC600B, which is our SATA SSD, and we've got drives 1 and 2, which are our M.2 SSDs. So I want to install Windows on the M.2 SSD, so I'm going to go ahead and select drive 1 and click Next. And this next stage will just take a little bit of time, so I'll speed it up for you. Okay, so as we go along, I'm going to pick a series of options. Obviously, if you have different options, go on ahead and pick the options that you want. So I'm in the United Kingdom, I'm going to click Yes. Keyboard layout, the United Kingdom as well. I don't want a secondary keyboard, so I'm going to click Skip. I'm going to set it up for personal use, so I'm going to click on that and Next. Now we've got a couple of options here. If you have a Microsoft account, you go ahead and enter your details. If you don't, you can create an online account, or you also have an option of an offline account, so you don't need to be connected to the internet to set up Windows. I'm going to show you the offline account for this one. Again, it's going to give you some prompts that maybe you want to go ahead and set up the online account. I'm going to go for limited experience with an offline account, and then it's going to ask me to type my name. Click Next and make a password. Confirm the password. And then I'm going to have to fill in some security questions. Okay, we've got a series of options here, so I'm going to choose not to use online speech recognition and click Accept. So let Microsoft Apps use your location. I'm going to click on Yes, Accept. Find my device, Yes, Accept. Send diagnostic data to Microsoft. We're just going to send the required diagnostic data. Improve inking and typing. I'm going to click No to that. No again. No again. And I'm going to go for Not Now. Okay, so that's Windows installed. The first thing I like to do is get Windows fully up to date before I'll go ahead and install any drivers or programs. So to do that, we're going to click on the Windows icon on the bottom left hand corner, click on the settings, click on updates and security, and then we're going to go check for updates. What we're going to do is we're going to do any updates that are there. There's probably quite a few to install. We'll let them install. The computer may well need to restart. We're going to go back into the settings and check for any more updates, and we're not going to move forward until there's no more updates available. Okay, so that's Windows fully up to date. Next thing for us to do is to get all our SSDs showing up. So we head over to this PC. What you will notice is we've got our local disk C. This is the M.2 SSD, the 1TB drive that we've installed our operating system in. Normally, if you've installed other new drives, they won't show up here. I have previously used this KC600 drive in another build and haven't formatted it again, so that's why it's currently showing up rather than being unavailable. So to get our other M.2 SSD drive to show up, what we'll need to do is go down the bottom here into the search and type in disk management. And this will come up with a shortcut to the control panel, create and format hard drive partitions. So we'll go ahead and click on that. It's going to give us a pop-up about disk 2, and it's going to tell us that we need to initialize the disk before we can use it. So we'll go ahead and click OK. Okay, so now if we see what we've got our SATA SSD, disk 1, which is one of our M.2 SSDs, and if we scroll down here, we've got our second drive, which is currently showing as unallocated space. So if I right click on it and click new symbol volume, next, next, it's assigned the drive the letter E, so I'm going to leave it as that and click next. If I want to change it, I can do that from the pull down menu, and then we just need to give it a name. And then I'm going to click on next and finish. Okay, so what we can now see is back over in my computer, the drive is now available and ready to use. Next thing for us to do is install some drivers. I'm going to get these from a variety of sources. Don't worry about trying to remember all the web pages as you go along. I'm going to put links to them all in the description. Okay, so starting off with our motherboard page over on MSI's website. So we're on the drivers tab and we just need to select our operating system, Windows 10 64-bit, and I'll go ahead and expand all these to show you what we have on offer. Okay, so looking at the drivers, we've got the AM4 RAID driver. I'm not going to use this, so there's no point downloading it. If you want to use RAID, you can obviously download the driver. The AMD chipset driver, we do want this, but I'm going to get this directly from AMD's website. It tends to be a little bit more up to date there. The onboard VGA drivers, we've got a dedicated graphic card rather than using integrated graphics, and we're going to get our drivers from NVIDIA. So as we're not going to use this, there's no point downloading it. So we'll go ahead and download the Bluetooth driver. Now most of these three drivers, Windows will have found alternative versions to all the drivers we're going to install here. I'm going to show you how to install them for completeness, but the steps are quite often optional. If your computer's working well, you can quite often just leave it. Click on the wireless setup. We're going to go to extract all, click extract. And then click on the wireless setup. Click yes. Next. Next. I accept. Next. We're just going for a typical install and click install. And finish. Okay, we'll get the Intel Wi-Fi drivers next. Download. I will click on the installer, click on the wireless setup, click extract all, extract. And click on the wireless setup. We're going to click next, agree, install, yes. And finish. And last one here is the Ethernet drivers. Okay, we'll click on the setup file. Yes. Click Next, Install. And then Finish. Okay, and then the last driver we have here is the onboard audio driver, so we'll go ahead and download that. Click on the setup file. Yes. Next. And we're going to go ahead and restart our computer, so we'll click Finish. Okay, so that's all the drivers that we're going to install from MSI's page. Just before we leave here, I'll show you a couple of other things. If we go over and click on Utilities, you can see here we've got the MSI Dragon Center. Now, if your motherboard has RGB on it, or if you've actually plugged any RGB fans into either the addressable or the standard RGB header on the motherboard, you're going to want to install this to allow you to control the lighting on the motherboard and anything actually connected to the motherboard's RGB headers. Our motherboard doesn't actually have any RGB on it. The only thing that has RGB is the RAM. We're going to use the RAM manufacturer's software to control the lighting on it, so we're not going to need to install this. The other thing we might want to install is the BIOS. So we have a look and see the latest version is from the 16th of November. And I am planning on getting a new CPU in the future. So it probably is worth me updating the BIOS. I don't routinely recommend updating the BIOS unless there's new features that you need or you're having problems with your computer. Because if you do it wrong, you can actually brick your motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and download this now. Okay, and if I head over to the downloads, I'm going to copy the file and put it onto an external hard drive which I've plugged in to the computer. And this is going to allow me to install the BIOS later when we head over to it. Okay, so we're finished with MSI's page, but we haven't finished installing all the drivers that we're going to need to. Next thing is to head over to AMD's page to get the chipset driver. Okay, so we're over on AMD's page. We're going to click on chipsets. We've got an AM4 socket and we've got a B550 motherboard. So we're going to click Submit. We're going to expand here and we can see that the latest driver there. So we're going to click Download. Go ahead and open this. Click Yes. And we're going to go ahead and click Install. Okay, so that's installed successfully. We'll click on Restart. Okay, last driver for us to get is for our graphics card. We have an NVIDIA graphics card, so we're going to need to get our drivers from NVIDIA's site. We can either get the drivers separately like we've done before, or we can actually go ahead and install the GeForce Experience. I prefer to do this, so I'm going to go and show you how to do this. Click Download Now. Go ahead and open it. Click Yes. We'll agree and install. Okay, if you don't have an account, you need to create one, so I'm going to put my login details in. Okay, I'm going to skip the tour. And then what we need to do is click on Drivers. And then if we click on these three dots up at the top right hand corner, you can choose which version of the driver you want. So you can either install a game ready driver or a studio driver. A question I often get asked, can we not install both? The answer is no, you have to pick between them. So if you play more games, go for the game ready driver. If you use your PC more for content creation, pick the studio driver. They will work for, like the studio driver will work for gaming and the game driver will work for content creation, but they're optimized for one or the other. So one you're going to have a slightly better experience in. I prefer to use my PC for content creation, so I'm going to click the studio drivers. So it's found the latest version. I'm going to click download. Okay, I'm just going to go for an express installation, so I'll click on that. Click yes. And then we need to expect the screen to flicker as the drivers have been installed. Don't worry, that's normal. Okay, that's it installed. We'll click on close. Okay, so we need to download the lighting control for our RAM. So I'll click on download and open file. Double click on the application, yes, next, next, install. It's going to ask us to restart our computer. We'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we've got a range of effects over here: static breathing, strobing, cycle, rainbow, breathing rainbow, comet, and comet rainbow. We've got the individual LEDs and the colors they're currently set to, and we can change these using here or here. Because we can't actually see our RAM very well because the front panel isn't tempered glass, I'm going to go ahead and turn the RAM off so it's not distracting. So I click on LED off and click apply. Okay, so that's everything installed that I want to install in Windows. Next thing for us to do is to go over to the BIOS. We're going to update the BIOS. We're going to need to look at our RAM speed, because the chances are our RAM is not running at the full 3600 megahertz. And then we want to have a look at the fan curves to check all our coolers and fans are running just the way we want them to. So to enter the BIOS, what we need to do is click on Restart. And then whenever the MSI logo appears at the start, we need to press the delete key. It can be hard to time it right, so normally once the screen goes to black, I start pressing the delete key, and then that way we're not going to miss it. So it's gone black. I'm going to start pressing the delete key now. And there's the logos appeared, and we should now load into the BIOS. Okay, so looking at the version of the BIOS that is installed, the one that is from the 31st of August 2020, we've got a much later one, so I'm going to go ahead and update it. Like I've mentioned, don't do this unless you have to, because you can brick your motherboard if things go wrong. It's really important that you don't lose power during the install, or there's a good chance you will brick your motherboard. So to update the BIOS, we need to use the M-Flash utility, so we'll go ahead and click on it. And we're going to go yes. Okay, so what we need to do is select the version of the BIOS that we want to install. So we've got our file here. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And it's asking us, are we sure we want to select this file? I'm going to click yes. And then we'll go ahead and let the BIOS install. Like I've mentioned, really important that your computer does not lose power during this process. Okay, so the PC has rebooted into Windows after the BIOS update. So I'm going to restart things again and re-enter the BIOS. Okay, so that's us into the BIOS, and what we can see is the version has been updated to the latest one from the 14th of November. Next thing for us to do is to have a look at our memory speed. So we click on the memory. What you will notice, our memory is currently running at 2133 megahertz. Our memory is rated for 3600 megahertz, so we look over here, there's two XMP profiles, profile 1 and profile 2, which are exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and enable profile 1 by clicking up here. And that should increase our memory speed up to 3600 megahertz. Next thing for us to do is to have a look at our fans and make sure they're set up the way I want them to. So I'm going to click on settings. Okay, so looking at our fans, the first one is our CPU fan. It's on auto mode, and we've got 4-pin fans plugged in, so I'm just going to click on PWM mode. Shouldn't actually change anything. And we can see smart fan mode is enabled. I normally leave smart fan mode on, so I'm not going to change that. If we go over to our system fan, so this is where 3 of our fans are running via the PWM splitter cable. Now all 3 of those fans are PWM fans. If we look at the moment, we can see they're running in DC mode. So I'm going to go ahead and flick that over to PWM mode. Now we can see it's running in PWM mode. It's taking its temperature off the CPU core, which is fine, and I'm just going to enable smart fan mode as well. Okay, so looking at our pump header settings, it's set to PWM mode, which is fine. We've got a 4-pin fan. It's taking a temperature off the CPU core, which is the same as our system fans. I can go ahead and enable smart fan mode. What we'll notice though, the fans are running at slightly different speeds. Part of that is because these settings over here are different. They're obviously optimized for a pump, whereas the ones over in the system fan one are optimized for a case fan. So I'm just going to go ahead and match the settings. So having a look at 85 degrees, the fan runs at 100%. So we'll go ahead and change that. At 70 degrees, it runs at 90%. At 55 degrees, it runs at 70%. And then at 40 degrees, it runs at 50%. Okay, so what we now can see, the fan speeds are fairly similar, and if we look at the curves, they're identical. Okay, so we can close things down here, and then to save our settings, all we need to do is press the X button. It'll give us a summary of everything that we have changed here, and we're going to click Yes to save the settings and load Windows. First thing to do is to check our RAM is running at the correct speed. To do this, right click on the Windows icon and go to Task Manager. We're then going to click on More Details, click on the Performance tab, and then click on the memory. So what we can see, our memory speed is now 3600 megahertz. Okay, so that's the PC up and running just the way I wanted to. I am planning now on doing quite a bit of thermal testing with a variety of different configurations. So I'm going to move some fans about, maybe try without some fans and see what difference that makes to the temperatures and the noise. I'm then going to release that as a thermal testing case review video. So if you are thinking of building in this case and following this tutorial, it's probably worth checking that out as well before you start to see do I then recommend any changes to what I've done in this video. Likewise, I am planning on making a water-cooled build using an AIO in the same case. And again, links to the thermal testing video and review and to that build guide using the AIO will also be in the description to this video. So again, it's worth checking that out to see, do you prefer the air-cooled build or the build with the AIO? So hopefully you find this video useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please click that subscribe button. The channel is growing really well, but your subscription can make a difference and help me grow the channel and reach more viewers. Likewise, if you're new to the channel, I've got loads of PC related content, lots of build guides, so it's worth checking that out as well. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
We never show emotions, we just keep it down inside. Yeah, you and I, both longing for expression for the things we like, but we stay quiet. Hold me now, tell me things, tell me all about how you feel. Just let yourself go. Say it loud, wake the world on the other side, make it real. Just let yourself go. Just let go. Ooh, just let go. Oh yeah, just let go. Ooh, just let go. only things that